Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Now, today, I wanted to talk a little bit about the support that the state of Ukraine is receiving from predominantly Western European nation states and obviously the United States as well. If you look at the amount of equipment that has been transferred from Western and some Eastern European nation states to the Ukraine, it would make Ukraine the most powerful military in all of Europe. In all of Europe. Now, obviously, the Russians are degrading and destroying a lot of that capability on a daily basis. But in terms of weapons and equipment, the amount of systems that have been supplied to the Ukrainians, again, would make Ukraine the most powerful military in all of Europe. Now, what has been given to the Ukrainians? So first, anti-tank guided weapon systems, anti-tank weapon systems, non-guided systems. At this point, we can't even calculate the amount of those systems that have been handed over to the Ukrainians. At this point, I believe that count has been lost because so much has been handed over to the Ukrainians. Much of the entire United Kingdom's anti-tank guided weapon capability was handed over to the Ukrainians. Massive amounts of U.S. stockpiles and javelins and AT-4s and TOWs and other systems were handed over to the Ukrainians as well. So it's difficult to count those systems. But heavier systems, we can get a better idea of exactly what has been handed over. So, for instance, let's look at drones. The Turkish TB2 Bayraktar, 35 plus of those systems were handed over to include the many more of the MAM-L air-to-ground missile system that is used by the TB2 drone. So 35 of those. Tanks. Western powers have pledged 860 plus tanks, of which 580 main battle tanks have been delivered. As we speak, I don't believe there is another country in Western Europe other than Poland who actually has more than 580 main battle tanks. So let's just round it out and just say 600. Because more are going to be delivered because approximately 860 to about 900 have been pledged to the Ukrainians. Now, many of those are, in fact, T-72 variants. The Poles have delivered 250 T-72s. They've also delivered a heavily upgraded version of the T-72. It's called the PT-91. Then obviously other Western European nation states have handed over Leopard 1s, Leopard 2s, obviously M1A1 main battle tanks from the United States as well. Now, in terms of infantry fighting vehicles, such as BMPs, Bradleys, what have you, the Ukrainians have received 560 of those systems. 560. And again, many of them are fairly advanced, high-end systems such as the M2A2 Bradley, with the United States giving the Ukrainians 186. The CV90s, 50 of those have been handed over. 200 KTO Rosomax from Poland. So again, a host of systems. Armored personnel carriers. 1,250 have been delivered. with 2,200 pledged. That includes American-made M113s, YPR 765s, and just really a host of systems that have been handed over to the Ukrainians. 189 strikers included in that total. Mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, MRAPs. 925 delivered, with over 1,150 pledged. So we're looking at thousands, quite literally thousands, of tanks, armored infantry fighting vehicles, and armored personnel carriers handed over to the Ukrainians. I mean, we're pushing about 3,000 vehicles, just armored types of vehicles that are going to be handed over to the Ukrainians. It's impressive. Infantry mobility vehicles. This is like Humvees, all-terrain vehicles that are very important to military conflicts. I mean, you have to move infantry, you have to supply those infantry, and the Ukrainians are getting over 3,000 of those systems have been handed over to the Ukrainians. Towed artillery, the god of war. 430 systems from Western European and the United States have been handed over. 430 systems. Self-propelled artillery, the uber god of war. 405 systems delivered with 555 pledged. And again, just massive amounts of both artillery and, more importantly, artillery rounds for those systems. Just massive amounts. Multiple launch rocket systems, 105 have been delivered to include HIMARS. 38 HIMARS have been delivered by the United States, and then obviously you have 14 HIMARS variant systems delivered by the United Kingdom and Germany. Five of those systems as well. Anti-aircraft artillery. 375 systems delivered. Self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, 170 delivered. Surface-to-air missile systems. Obviously, the information that I'm getting is just based on batteries. So Patriot batteries from the United States, other European allies, and a host of other anti-aircraft missile-based weapon systems as well. Harpoon, surface-to-surface missile systems. And I'm not really going to get into those systems too much because, again, it almost becomes just too much to count. But the short story is just thousands of these heavier armored personnel carriers, tanks, armored fighting vehicles delivered to the Ukrainians. And then money, cash, hard currency. It would be very difficult for the Ukrainian nation state to continue this war without having the ability to pay its armed forces, its paramilitary units. That takes a lot of money. And the United States and Western European allies are propping up the Ukrainian government in the amount of billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars in hard currency. Hand it over to the Ukrainians and they can do with it as they wish. And obviously that includes propping up their own military-industrial complex. We know the Ukrainians have the ability and are continuing to try and build weapon systems internally. And that's going to become even more important for the Ukrainians in the coming months and possibly years as this war continues. Because it looks like the spigot is slowly going to get turned off. So here in the United States, the Democratic Party, the Doves, the party that traditionally, going back decades and decades, has tried to create the perception that it is anti-war. Well, we obviously know that. That's a complete farce. Complete farce. The Democratic Party that is now in control of the White House is continuing this war. This war, in all probability, would have ended had the United States not did what it did in terms of directly supporting the Ukrainians. So why? Why is the Biden administration so infatuated with Zelensky and the concept of Ukraine? Most Americans here in the United States, if you go to any college in the United States prior to the ongoing war, and you were to ask any college student, where is Ukraine? I would wager 95% could not locate Ukraine on a map. It is widely known that Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, did not know the location of Ukraine. She could not find it on a map. So the question is, what made this guy, the son of Joseph Biden, gravitate towards Ukraine? Obviously, criminal. Known drug user, drug addict, various forms of drugs to include crack cocaine. But what drove this individual? What drove Hunter Biden to Ukraine? What drove a very corrupt individual to Ukraine? Now, I've talked about in the past about his direct commission. And his father, Joseph Biden, has been an enabler in his criminal activity. His father, as vice president, was able to get Hunter Biden a direct commission in the U.S. military. I've talked about this before. A direct commission is a very, very rare occurrence. Most persons who receive commissions in the U.S. military, or essentially all, have to go through a military academy or they go through some sort of rigorous officer candidacy program. A direct commission was designed for very specialized skills, such as maybe a surgeon, a very educated professional that the U.S. military needs as soon as possible. And that's why they created the direct commission program. Joseph Biden gave his son, who is essentially an incompetent attorney at the time, a direct commission. The U.S. Navy was so flabbergasted about this that the first day on duty, they asked for a urinalysis of Hunter Biden, and he failed it, and he was kicked out of the U.S. military. But the information I have is the U.S. military was incredibly upset over Joseph Biden using his power to push crackhead Hunter into the U.S. military with a direct commission. No training, no nothing. Into the military he goes. So again, what drove Hunter Biden to Ukraine? Well, Ukraine is an incredibly corrupt nation state. Probably the most corrupt nation state in all of Western and Eastern Europe combined. Incredibly corrupt, massively corrupt. And that gave Hunter Biden an atmosphere in which he could thrive. Now, and in doing so, in doing what he did with Burisma, and who knows who else in Ukraine, gave the Ukrainian state leverage over now President Joseph Biden. And that's where we are. And that's what's happening. On a side note, you know who the biggest donors to the Democrat Party in the United States are? Well, I kind of let it slip as I went through some of the pictures. Top on the list is George Soros. An individual who has proclaimed that he essentially despises the United States. And his actions in terms of what he does with his businesses and his money, more importantly, proves just that. Number two, this guy, Sam Bankman-Fried. He headed up the now defunct FTX, the cryptocurrency exchange. Number two on the list of Democrat donors. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Sam Bankman-Fried, George Soros. Top donors to the Democratic Party. So back to the ongoing map. Back to the ongoing war. Before we depart, I think it's worth noting that it is being reported now over the past week. Ukrainian forces have suffered on all fronts, on all areas of operations, from Kherson to areas near Donetsk, which includes Avdiivka, just to the north of Donetsk, operations near Kupiansk, further to the north. The Ukrainian military has sustained approximately 3,000 casualties over the past week. Now, a lot of those casualties, as I've talked about on previous videos, were not directly caused by, let's say, direct engagements between military units, meaning a Russian tank, armored infantry fighting vehicle, or infantry directly engaging Ukrainian tanks, armored fighting vehicles, or infantry. The vast majority of casualties that have occurred in the Ukrainian military, those 3,000 casualties over the past week, have come from Russian aviation, drones, or long-range artillery. And we believe over the past week, Ukrainian casualties have far exceeded those of Russian casualties. The Russians have the aviation. They have an air force. And they're using it. The Russians are now producing monolithic amounts of drones. Massive amounts of drones. The drone output, the drone strikes that we are now seeing by the Russians is on a level not seen since the start of the war. Essentially, there were not many Russian drone strikes at the start of the war. But as the Russians have started to mass produce these systems, including the Lancet and other quadcopter systems that are being obtained through China and other resources, we are seeing just this huge uptick in Russian drone strikes. The Russian drone strikes are now far outpacing the capability in drone strikes in which the Ukrainians are able to hit back. And then furthermore, the Russians are starting to utilize more and more advanced electronic warfare capability that negates Ukraine's own drone capability. So this has to be very concerning for the Ukrainians, especially as the United States weighs ongoing support. And again, I can tell you here in the United States, I think that support is drawing to a close. Here in the United States, people are more worried about inflation. They're worried about what's happening to the economy. They're worried about the political division inside the United States. They're worried about the prospects of a unitary one-party state as the Democrats use the power of the Department of Justice to go after political enemies. We've never seen that here in the United States, and we're seeing it now. So that's where we sit for today. More to come very, very soon. As always, we appreciate you being here. We appreciate you watching us. Have a good day.